This talk probably dovetails quite nicely with what Kerry was saying this morning about the external pressures on the industry and how they are perceived by the customers, both our retail customers and eventually the final consumers. Just a brief bit about me. Most of you probably know me at least by correspondence, if not by HR. I've been at SATRA for 18 years. Prior to that, I worked for British Coal. Just going to talk a little bit about chromium and leather background, which you probably already know, but just to re-establish where this comes from, and then look at the specific requirements of the legislation, and again, what has been behind that. It's part of the REACH legislation, so again, it's part of this long process of regulation and investigation of safety in order to produce a future regulatory regime where all chemicals are controlled. But of course, this regulation is just a stepping stone on a much longer path, and I'm going to hint at what's going to happen there. At the moment, these are possibilities of developments, but I think it's important that we're aware of them so that we can formulate our response to these developments as a society and as an industry. And briefly comment on really what things that Kerry was saying about how the industry responds to the questions that is asked of it around these issues. Chromium. As a metal, it's a hard, corrosion-resistant metal with a high melting point. But in nature, it is rarely found in that metallic form. Importantly, most of it is not used within our industry. 85% of the chromium used worldwide goes to the steel production and in metal plating. So when you talk about chromium in its totality, the chromium that is used in leather is only a very small amount of the total chromium in the world. Chromium compound, one of the versatilities is that it will exist in a range of valencies. When we talk about chrome tan leather, we are talking about trivalent chromium, chrome 3, which is relatively harmless. It's actually required as an essential element for the metabolism of food within the diet. Hexavalent chromium, chrome 6, skin irritant, carcinogen, and environmental pollutant. That is where the issue is. As I say, this is going to come as no surprise to any of you, but most of the leather used in consumer goods is chrome tanned. That's 85%. And if you talk about shoe uppers, that rises to 95%. So any threat to chromium tanned leather is a threat to the industries that use that leather. So, typical values of chromium content in leather is about 3 to 5%. And if you think about chromium, the atomic weight, the molecular mass of chromium is about 52. And so when you calculate out how much chromium is in a finished leather in terms of milligrams per kilogram, if you've got about 4% chromic oxide, which is how you measure the chromium content in a leather, and that's what the picture illustrates, the chromium content test that actually measures the amount of chromium. Because again, it's there to add the strength, and you vary the amount to give you the physical properties that you need. You calculate it out. So if you've got about 4% chromic oxide content, that will mean you've got about 30,000 milligrams per kilogram of chromium in your leather, just the chromium. And that is important. That 30,000 number is important because if you think about it, when we get on to discussing the requirements, we're talking about a part per million level, 3 parts per million, compared to 30,000 parts per million of chromium in its trivalent state. So it only needs a very small amount of the chromium that's actually present in the leather to convert by oxidation into the hexavalent form for you to be getting into a stage where there is concerns being raised about that product and its health, its effect on the health of users. Hexavalent chromium is formed by oxidation. That oxidation can happen either during transport and storage or by exposure to certain chemicals. The exact mechanism is a matter of debate, and I'm not going to go into that today, but it is established that it can happen. So, there's a lot of issues been raised. It's an environmental hazard, and there is a lot of debate about the solid chromium waste that comes from tanneries, whether Chrome-6 can form on products that are left out in the sun in India, and that was raised in the blacksmith report. Again, it was raised as a theoretical possibility. There was not so much data yet to establish whether or not this happened and to what extent it happens. And there has to be this understanding between what is a theoretical possibility and what actual measurements have been taken in the field to prove that this does and does not happen, and what can be done to prevent that happening. It could be that simple waste control measures could stop that forming. Again, it could be very easy to respond to. It's a carcinogen, and it's a dermatological irritant. So obviously carcinogens tend to be a long-term exposure, whereas dermatological irritant is something that you see instantly. On an aside, chromium is an allergen, and there are a number of individuals who will respond to wearing leather by developing a type 4 allergic reaction. But that is the reaction to Chrome 3. It's not a reaction to Chrome 6. So they're allergic to the chromium. But that allergic reactions are considered to be personal idiosyncrasies, and it's not because there is harmful materials in those in that substance, in that product. In some cases, some allergens have been considered to be so widespread that steps have been taken to control them. And a good example is nickel within the jewellery trade. And so any metallic items, such as jewellery, watch straps, even things like rivets on clothing, have been controlled by an axe breach so that they don't contain free nickel, which can migrate onto the skin. And that's purely because there is a widespread allergic reaction to nickel. But here we're talking about specific dermatological irritant Chrome 6, which is, will affect a fair number of people. Before REACH got involved, chromium 6 was already restricted in certain circumstances. Any people involved in personal protective equipment, particularly it came originally from the glove industry. And if you think about a leather glove, there you have very, very intense, intimate, prolonged contact between skin and the leather. And often you're doing manual work, so again, there's a lot of sweat generation. So here, there really was a risk of any soluble chromium 6 coming out of the leather onto the skin and being available to react with either skin or be absorbed in the skin, again, as a health concern. So the glove, the European standard for protective gloves, EN 420, contained a clause where you had to have an assessment of chromium 6 as part of the CE marking process. You wouldn't be able to obtain the CE mark unless you had that tested. That requirement extended not just to gloves, but also to leather footwear and any other leather protective garments, such as aprons or clothing. So it was well established that there was a risk, there was a concern, and there were steps in place and obviously methods to actually measure this and be able to determine whether or not the cause was present and to make a decision on its usability based on it. The general product safety approach that exists in Europe and covers into the UK General Product Safety Directive then would extrapolate that into general consumer goods. So even before REACH got involved, we have noticed over the past few years more and more goods being removed from sale in returns. There's what's called RAPEX, which is a European information exchange where you can go on and see all the product recalls that have been issued across Europe and determine the reason for them. And we've seen more and more of those associated with Chrome 6 in leather goods, even though the new REACH legislation hasn't yet come into force. But Chromium 6 was already part of REACH Annex 17. Obviously, REACH, registration, evaluation, authorization of chemicals, I spoke about this at this conference in previous years, is the regulation that has replaced the old marketing and use directives in terms of regulating consumer goods. But that is just one small part of the wider REACH legislation, which controls the whole use of chemicals within the European Union, from manufacture through to retail. Entry 47 of the Annex 17 to REACH, and Annex 17 is the list of those substances that are controlled. Entry 47 deals with Chromium 6, but the current version only applies to cement and concrete products, because that's another area where chromium is heavily used. Warren just spoke about its use in bricks as well. And that's where a lot of pollution issues have been associated with Chromium 6. And so the Entry 47 applies those controls to cement. However, during 2014, the regulation was published which extends Entry 47 from 1st of May 2015, which is Friday, to Chromium 6 content of leather come into contact with the skin. And on the next slide, I have the precise text. These are the 3 paragraphs that have been added to Entry 47 for Chrome 6. And this is, as a supplier of leather within Europe, these are your requirements. Leather articles coming into contact with the skin shall not be placed on the market where they contain Chromium 6 in concentrations equal to or greater than 3 milligrams per kilogram of the total dry weight of the leather. Articles containing leather parts coming into contact with the skin should not be placed on the market where any of those leather parts contains Chromium 6 in concentrations equal to or greater than 3 milligrams per kilogram of total dry weight of that leather part. Paragraphs 5 and 6 shall not apply to the placing on the market of second-hand articles which were in end use in the Union before the 1st of May 2015. So, paragraph 7 is a derogation for existing product, but the important points are in clauses 5 and 6. Placed on the market and leather articles or parts of leather articles coming into contact with the skin. So, if you look at your product, you've got to assess what are the chances of it coming into contact with the skin. If it's a shoe, particularly you might want to think about the leather linings, but does the outer of a rugged outdoor boot need to comply with that requirement? if you're looking at furniture, then obviously there is a much greater possibility of leather coming into contact with the skin. Gloves, I've already spoken about, there is clear intimate contact. Think about luggage, handbags. But again, it's a part of your risk assessment to decide whether or not you feel that there is justification for the skin contact. If there is any doubt within your mind, it would be safer to make sure that your product complies. But again, you have to be careful about knowing exactly what it says in 301/2014 and what your customer thinks it says. And if you go back to when the azodide legislation was introduced, again, azodides very clearly, it states leathers and dyed leathers and textiles that come into contact with the skin. And it then lists 22 aromatic amines that the dyes can break down to. When this was first introduced, there were some retailers who believed that this applied to the whole classification of azo dyestuffs, and therefore would make statements in their restricted substance list saying no azo dyes should be present in leather. And the azo dye is probably one of the biggest classifications of dyestuffs there are. So again, understanding the difference between saying, oh, Chrome 6 is banned, and actually what the detail of the legislation says is important. And of course, when you're having commercial discussions with your customers, you don't want to get into that order, but they've got to understand the practicalities and the importance of the industry. Fortunately, there is an established methodology for testing chromium 6 because, as I say, it's already had this history of being used in the PPE CE marking requirements. So therefore, there is an established test method. 17075 is a colorimetric method using diphenylcarbazide. And it has a detection limit of 3 parts per million. This has come down quite considerably from the 10 parts per million that was originally introduced. And then they dropped the detection limit to 3 parts per million, but again they had to change the method to make it more sensitive to give us that level. And really, the detection limit has now become the requirement. Germany has, for quite a while, of its own ordinance, said no chromium 6 in consumer goods. And there are also a similar restriction in the toy standard, but that's more about what can be extracted through mouthing and sucking of toy materials. So I'm not going to go into detail on toy restriction, but say that it's part of a package of controls around chromium 6. There has been a proposal and a move to include aging as part of the determination of chromium 6. Really, this was a step basically designed to test a leather or a leather product to see whether it would form chromium 6 during its lifetime. So conditions were devised, you would expose your product to that condition, and then measure the chromium 6 content after that aging. However, those conditions are considered to be harsh, and as of yet, no one has come up with a direct correlation between what actually happens over time with products that form chromium 6 and aging conditions. However, there is ongoing research on that topic in order to find a set of conditions that may actually correlate more closely with reality. But, and this again, the important point to understand what is a requirement of Annex 17 and what is a requirement of your customs RSL list. Some customers have included aging steps within their requirements, but they are not part of the legislation. That is part of their requirements. An important distinction. Again, the ageing conditions, there were high temperature and very low humidity, and they were found to increase the amount of chromium-6 produced, but without long studies to see what actually would happen to those leathers in standard storage with no aging conditions. We can't say that they are definitely going to predict which of those leathers would form chromium-6 over time. The way that the decision was reached on 301/2014 was that Denmark, as a member of the European Union, put forward a proposal to put this restriction in. It then went to various European committees to take technical and practical decisions and assess the impact. And a risk assessment was produced for consideration with recommendations. One point that is within that risk assessment is that the 3 milligrams per kilogram requirement, based on the detection level of the method, is still above the no observable effect limit for chromium-6 on human health. But because of the limitations of the analysis, it means that unless they can require a better method of detection and measurement, there can be no possibility of reducing that limit level at the moment. However, there is a potentially new method of measurement on the horizon. That is being currently discussed under the SEN Leather Committee, TC289, and that would be ion chromatography. Now, the important thing about this test method, it will not initially directly replace ISO 17075. It will be an alternative. So basically it will be a second part to ISO 17075. In a similar way that there are two test methods for formaldehyde for leather, you can choose which detection technique, one's colorimetric or using HPLC. They're not directly comparable, you can choose which either one you use. And that will be the situation. So there will be a colorimetric method, and if this is established, an ion chromatography method. But at that stage, it will not be the sole method. And as a laboratory or as a user, you'll be able to specify which method you prefer. But the likelihood is that the ion chromatography is going to be have a lower limit of detection, which means if there is pressure to lower the acceptance limit closer towards the no observable effect limit, then they may have to drop the colorimetric method and go for the ion chromatography. Just to make people aware, there is also a change proposed in the Leather Committee to look at preparation of leather samples for testing. At the moment, all chemical tests are carried out on ground leather. What they want to do is then change that to cut samples of leather. At the moment, there is a lot of discussion about whether cutting can actually produce a sufficiently controlled sample. And the UK certainly are putting comments in through TCI 69 that we are expressing concerns about that, because unless they change the method, a lot of other methods will be, you'll be having to do two sets of preparation, one for grinding and one for cutting, because some of the other standards will not have changed. However, we are keeping an eye on that, and of course the Society and SATRA and the other organisations that are represented at the committee level are putting their input into those. As I say, the SLTC has a role in the UK Mirror Committee, which is TCI 69, which covers leather, footwear and coated fabrics. The TCR 69, several of the members are involved in a round-robin trial at European level on presence of chromium-6 in leather in order to see if we can get the detection limit for iron chromatography down. But if detection limits on the methods does not automatically follow back through into detection limits in the legislation, they are unlikely to be lowered immediately, but there is downward pressure on them following on from the risk assessment that's carried out in order to get to the stage of 301/2014. Chromium tan leather is still very widely used across the industry, particularly in footwear replies, but also in a wide range of other. And it is still a product that has many, many desirable quantities. What is happening from next week is that there is now a requirement to measure and be able to demonstrate that products are free from chrome-6 when they're placed on the market. But industry has had to adapt to a lot of changes, and we've seen that through all things. And it is only a very small change in these products that requires these values. It is a challenge. It is a challenge, but I know that a lot of tanneries are perfectly comfortable with being able to produce leathers that will meet these requirements. The danger is that it is going to require a lot of input in order to make sure that at every stage of processing you're not introducing something that is actually potentially going to change the product that you accept at the factory gate through to the product that you put on the shelf within the European Union. And this is going to require some quality control, but it is not a complete ban on the use of chromium leather. It should not be treated as such. It should not really be seen as a restriction on leather products. It's just that the leather products that are need to have this quality check that there is no chrome-6 that can cause dermatological reaction. To be honest, if you had a value of, say, 4 ppm of chromium-6, it's unlikely that you would get dermatological reactions. Because from the anecdotal evidence we've seen of when we have actually seen leathers that have caused dermatological reactions, you're probably talking about a 5 or 6-fold increase of that limit there. But the data that the European Union based their assessment on is a no observer effect limit being lower than 3 ppm. Because again, a lot of their studies have done with small vertebrates, where of course the body mass is going to be a lot lower, but you see changes more rapidly. So they're basing their data on exposure to animals again. That is the considered view of the European Union who are driving these regulations. But we have to adapt with those. And okay, that might require a little bit more assessment. It might require a bit of research and development within the tanning process, and it might require that retailers begin asking a lot more questions. But we've adapted to a lot of other things. We've seen azo dyes, PCP in the past. This is another in that list. And again, with REACH going on and on into probably the next 10 years, there are going to be more restrictions, and we just have to keep on top of it, and we have to help the industry understand what that means for the whole use of leather in their products. Hopefully that's been useful, and thank you very much for listening.